Okay, so greetings to everybody. Usually Rick Bowers would be speaking right now, our leader. He is in a raft deep in the Grand Canyon. And so it did not seem logical to have him try and chime in here. So on his behalf, I welcome everybody to the 15th Tiger Talk. Let me just talk about two class matters before we launch off into the event of the day. First is we have a reunion coming up. I'm not talking about regular reunions now, but a reunion in Hilton Head. There are about 50 classmates who are attending, plus wives and partners, so there are going to be over 100 people there. This is from October 26th through the 29th. As we sit here right now, we don't know if there's space for anyone else. We'll know that answer by Friday. So if there's anyone on this Zoom who is not already signed up, but would be interested in going if there's space, we're going to post, somebody is about to post, I hope. There it is right there in the chat. If you look at your chat, Rich Thomas's phone number and email. Rich Thomas is our classmate who, with 4 or 5 other classmates who live in Hilton Head, are coordinating all of this. So if you're interested, reach out to Rich, and by Friday, he should know if there's any more capacity. There are certain venues that only hold certain numbers of people, so it's a little fuzzy how that all works out. Secondly, I want to announce, this is the first announcement of a new class program. There will be much more material about this coming in the next couple of weeks. We've created a new program that we've dubbed the 66 Healthy Aging Network. And basically, over 20 of our classmates with medical degrees have agreed to serve as resources for classmates who wish to discuss medical issues affecting themselves or their family. They are not in place of your personal physician. This is a confidential conversation. It's an ability for you to talk to a friend, a classmate who might be able to offer some perspective on your situation, but they're not going to look at your patient records. They're not going to give you formal medical advice. They're not going to prescribe medicine. They're not going to be charging you any money. It's really an effort by the class leadership to find ways to assist all of us in aging gracefully, which is one of the themes of the class leadership. So as I said, there will be more information coming on that. Let me now spend a moment talking about the mechanics of this talk. The talk is being recorded as we speak. If you don't want to be seen, just turn off your camera and you won't be seen. And the only time that your camera we would hope be turned on is if you want to participate in the Q&A. But again, if you don't want to be seen, just turn off your camera. When Jeff finishes presenting, everybody will have a chance to ask questions. And the way for you to do that, if you want to ask a question, is to type into chat. Not raise your hand electronically, not raise your hand physically. Type into chat and type your question in there. You could even type in there, I have a question, and not say anything else, but I'd rather you typed in what your question is, short question, and send it to everybody. Don't just send it to me, send it to everybody, because that way, first of all, I'll definitely get it. Second of all, the speaker can see it, although he's going to be pretty busy and may not be looking at chat. So in any event, write it in chat. And then I will call on you, unless we run out of time, but assuming we don't run out of time, I will call on you and you'll be brought up on the screen and you can ask your question. Unless you want me to ask your question for you, in which case you can write that in the chat when you write in the question. Keep in mind that during the talk, you can choose either speaker view or gallery view. Gallery view being where you see the checkerboard, speaker view being where you see just a speaker. The closed caption feature has been turned on. So for anyone who likes to physically see what's being said, there's somewhere on your screen toward the bottom, it'll say CC or closed caption or something like that. click on it and you can turn it on if you like, and you can read the words. It's pretty accurate transcription, not perfect, but pretty accurate. Okay, so enough on instructions. We, of course, tried to get President Biden and Volodymyr Zelensky to join us today because of the topic. For some reason, they seem to be occupied in meetings, and so they had to regretfully decline. And so we're going to hear from Jeff Burt, which is the third best of the three people who could talk to us on the planet. Jeff is one of our most accomplished and internationally focused classmates. He came to Princeton from Montgomery Blair Senior High School in Maryland, studied at what we used to call the Woodrow Wilson School, and was business editor, and advertising manager of the Prince, president of the Economics Honor Society, Omicron Delta Epsilon, and active in Inward Clio. He went to Yale Law, clerked for a federal appellate judge, and then spent basically his entire career as a partner in the international law firm Arnold and Porter. Sorry, I lost my place here. His involvement in the Soviet Union began in the fall of 1986, when he was asked by the Soviet Committee on Science and Technology to make a presentation on his recently published textbook, International Joint Ventures. A few months later, the new Gorbachev regime passed the first legislation since the Bolshevik Revolution inviting Western firms to invest in their country. And in 1989 and 90, Jeff founded the Moscow office of Arnold and Porter, only the third international law firm to establish a base there, to represent Western companies in their commercial activities in Russia. He also served as chairperson of the American Bar Association's Committee on the Former Republics of the Soviet Union for several years. In more recent years, among a lot of activities, Jeff has been a visiting lecturer at Russia's largest law school. I know that might be an oxymoron, but nevertheless, there is a large law school in Russia, which he'll discuss in his talk. Jeff lives in Washington, D.C. with his wife, Sandra. They have 4 children and 8 grandchildren. I'm also going to mention that we have 2 other guests, Peter Pettibone, class of 61, and Jim Hitch, class of 71, who, like Jeff, have Russian expertise and who have collaborated with Jeff in prior presentations, including at our 50th reunion, where the 3 of them ran an alumni faculty forum on the subject of Russia. This is back closer to when Crimea was invaded. So I'll just say a few words about Peter and Jim. Peter is also a Woodrow Wilson School grad and a Harvard Law grad who lived in Russia for 20 years until 2010, and he's now an independent arbitrator and mediator focused on Russia and Ukraine-related commercial disputes. He also happens to be president of the class of 61. Jim majored in Russian studies and international affairs and also went to Harvard Law. He then worked for a major law firm, including being managing partner of the St. Petersburg and Kiev offices, or Kiev, I guess we pronounce it now. Let's just move on from there. And so, Jeff, I'm going to turn it over to you. Don't forget to unmute yourself, Jeff, and off you go.
Thank you very much, John, and thank you, Steve. There's an enormous amount of time and energy that's gone into these preparations, and I want to thank them for devoting so much time to hopefully making this go smoothly and have content that is very valuable, which is my responsibility. My subject today is the brutal and unprovoked invasion of Ukraine by Russia. My plan is to give you a few insights I have in the time that we have together, talk more or less where it's going, and then leave you with more questions than answers. This is a very difficult area to cover in 40 minutes. I'll try my best. At the beginning of our freshman year at Princeton, all of us experienced 13 days of enormous consequence for the world. We'd only been on campus for a few weeks when this happened. And you see the picture there of our friend Fidel Castro, Khrushchev, and of course, John F. Kennedy. Then, like now, an autocratic ruler of the #1 adversary of the United States believed he could pull off a fast and shift the world's balance of power through deceit and subterfuge. Indeed, he secretly was able to get 40,000 Russian soldiers to Cuba, quite an accomplishment. Khrushchev seriously miscalculated, however, but not before plunging the world in its most perilous time in human history. And I think most historians would endorse that view. And I know from conversations I had with a very senior lawyer at my law firm who was in the White House at the time and very close to the inner circle. I beg your pardon? And who was very close to the inner circle, that many of the people at the center of power went home Saturday night, the day before Khrushchev withdrew his missiles, with the deep feeling that there would be no tomorrow. Today, the world confronts another Russian autocrat who's convinced himself that he could also pull off a fast one and conquer Ukraine in a matter of a few days through a blitzkrieg and kill or imprison their leadership. The specter of a nuclear war is not as imminent and as scary right now as it was in the fall of our freshman year, at least right now. But the destabilizing effect of Putin's assault on the post-World War II international order is and will be profound for many years to come. I plan later in this presentation to return to the risk of nuclear Armageddon now confronting us. As we sit here today, no one here in Washington or anywhere in the world can confidently predict the outcome of this war and how many months, if not years, will pass before this all plays out. Hundreds of thousands of young men on both the Ukrainian and Russian sides have been and will continue to be killed and maimed. And the destruction of Ukraine's towns and cities, which we see television and the news, that over 6 million fleeing refugees from Ukraine, are all the direct results of what Putin has committed, an atrocity that takes us back to Hitler's times and the beginning of World War II. To give a global overview at the 50,000 level point of view, I want to quote here Timothy Ash, a brilliant Oxford historian. And he has an essay, and you'll find this essay and a number of the other things that I'm going to discuss today on a chat, the first chat you have, which I encourage you both to replicate if you can for future reference. And it will also appear in a later version of this that Steve and John are putting together. Ash told us that the Gorbachev's well-intentioned reforms ultimately morphed into, and here I'm quoting, the most spectacular peaceful collapse of any empire in history. Ash reminded us that we're now experiencing the death throes of the empires built by the Tsars and by the Bolsheviks in the early part of the 20th century. And he tells us this chaotic and dangerous period will likely continue for, quote, at least the next 20 years, if not another 40. It will be a long time before, quoting, Russia accepts that it lost an empire and begins to find its new role in the world. Ash adds that the path ahead for the Russian Federation will be especially difficult. Unlike old European states such as France and Portugal, which acquired and then lost overseas empires, Russia has no historically, geographically, or constitutionally well-defined state to return to. The Russian Federation itself consists of many ethnic and religious groups, such as Chechnya, Dagestan, and Tatarstan. In addition to Ukraine, which now occupies center stage, there are 9 other former republics that confront challenges of their own. These nations collectively occupy, and you've heard this many times, the largest landmass in the world, sweeping across 11 time zones. And all of your Russian experts will indicate that the magnitude of the country, just its size, is humbling. My colleagues, who John just mentioned, Peter Pettibone, class of 61, Jim Hitch, and class of 71, and we all participated in a Princeton event during our 50th reunion. They're in the audience today, and we'll make a few remarks at the beginning of the Q&A period, and I hope later as well. The three of us who frequently get together by Zoom and by email, occasionally in person, at various exchanges in the weeks prior to the February 24th invasion. And we all agreed, and here I want to quote Peter, that it probably wouldn't happen because, as Peter told us then, a puppet state would certainly not be recognized by most countries let alone by the Ukrainians themselves. There could be years of guerrilla warfare. And he closed his remark back then that it would create a real mess. I have that in caps. And if ever there was an understatement, this is one. Timothy Ash, expands a little bit on the real mess idea and tells us, quote, trying to restore the Russian world by force, Putin has destroyed it. In May 2013, 80% of Ukrainians said they had a positive attitude, good feelings about Russia. Last May, 2023, only 2% of Ukrainians gave that answer. Putin's delusional dream that he could unite Ukraine with Russia by force of arms has turned into a nightmare for the Russian people and for the world. At this point, I'd like to give a few personal reflections encouraged by John and Steve about my background and a few thoughts. Personally, upon my retirement, I had hoped and planned that in the coming years, I could serve as a part-time visiting lecturer at Russia's largest law school. I had many contacts there. It has 5 campuses in Moscow, and actually its enrollment, if you can believe this, it's a law university, mainly undergraduates, but that's the way their system works. It has over 15,000 students on these 5 campuses. Here there's a lecture hall about a lecture that I gave one of my early visits. We're looking at November 2018 when I was there. The lecture hall is beautiful, as you see, and on that tiny little figure in front of the lectern at the bottom of the picture, you can't see me too well, but that's me. And I note that Putin had stood in the same spot several years ago because it's used in Moscow for various reasons, and he came, of course, to this major law school. But also sitting there in 1924, and there's a plaque to that effect, was Stalin. He addressed the Communist Party that day, as possibly other days as well. They occupied that building, which may be one of the prettiest in all of Moscow, before the law school did. And I should add that when I stood there, knowing I was standing just where Stalin stood, a man responsible for the killing of millions of innocent people, I paused and I questioned whether I should even be there. And we can talk about that another time. By way of background, I had participated in a number of academic initiatives in the periods beginning in 2016 and formed friendships with and developed a great respect for many faculty members and students. The February invasion of Ukraine has extinguished all my involvement for that law school, and I think for the foreseeable future. I personally am disheartened and depressed when I think almost daily of the circumstances of my good friends who have been silenced, including the students there. You don't ask questions if you're in today's Russia, or if you're on the faculty at a law school there. A repressive state now governs their lives and the future of their children, some of whom I know. Even their small children have to be careful as to what they draw in school. In a widely publicized incident, a father was arrested because his little girl drew a picture that was sympathetic to Ukrainians. And one of my friends there that has a small child, we talked about that. One other point about my personal background. I was invited during one of my stays there to give a lecture to the law students. And the subject they wanted, and it's actually posted on the screen there, was the qualities necessary for a career in a big law firm in the United States. I began my comments with a brief introduction as to my origins and highlighted that my 3 grandparents, 3 of my 4, obviously, emigrated from Tsarist Russia at the beginning of the 20th century. And I thought the students there would be interested in that. And I started off by showing them a picture of my mother's father in uniform. And you see that picture before you now. That's Sergeant Philip Amsterdamer, who was born in the late 1870s, came to the United States in 1906. Before then, though, he served in Tsar's army for 5 years. And his trade was a tailor, but he rose to the rank of sergeant. And he was both Jewish and a non-commissioned officer, which was a very rare combination in those days. And on the other side of my family, my father's side, his mother came from Odessa, his father came from Kiev, and they were poor, penniless Russian children when they came at the turn of the century. When I was in that lecture hall, I shared with the law students in the beginning that had our families not taken different courses in their life's journey, and had I been able to get as good a grade as they got before they came to that law school, I could very well have been among them. And I felt that feeling that day and other days, and I believed they appreciated my identification, and frankly, it facilitated my many interchanges with this very bright group of people. They're the top, really very well educated. They're personable, bright, hardworking, and they want a world so much better than what's now confronting them in Putin's Russia. Many speak English. A number wanted to come to the United States to study and work abroad, and they sought my advice on how to apply here, and their plans, of course, are now dashed. We'll return to that a little later. Now, a little bit about my career. John did a very good job of telling in brief. Let me just review it in a little more detail. I became a partner at Arnold & Porter in 1978 after enduring the associate gauntlet. In the early 1980s, I was working closely with another young partner, and we began to represent a few Japanese firms in their joint venture activities in the United States. And my law firm encouraged entrepreneurial activity. We were young partners. We decided to expand our practice by organizing and chairing conferences on the subject of international joint ventures. And as part of this initiative, the two of us authored a textbook on this subject with a lengthy appendix of model contracts, ones we had designed on a paying basis, but now we were letting them out for free. And there you see a book cover of the textbook that we put together. There was the hard copy, kind of a dull green. My partner, who was a very talented artist, did the cover on the paperback edition of the book. The next turning point was when Gorbachev became General Secretary of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union in March of '85. And then reports followed that Russia might soon follow China's example and invite Western companies to form joint ventures with Soviet enterprises. But there was no legal foundation for such structures, so a new joint venture law would have to be enacted, as had been in China. And then my partner and I had the bright idea of floating a proposal with someone that a colleague knew at the Soviet embassy, that we would be willing to go to Moscow and conduct a seminar. And we said we'd do it for free, but we wanted to make sure our expenses were covered. We didn't want to impose that on our law firm or on our personal budget. We had an exchange, took a little bit, because we said we weren't going to fly Aeroflot. We didn't want to insult them, but they were known not to be terribly hospitable to travelers. And we said, we want to go on a European airline. Lufthansa had a good flight. And I'm happy to say they caved and we flew Lufthansa. What followed then was the embassy accepted our offer and just covered the expenses. And we went to Moscow in October of that year, and met with the 30 or so bureaucrats at the Soviet Committee on State and Technology to talk about what they needed to put in their new joint venture law. We spent a week there. And by the way, that's me. You can see in the center when I had a full head of hair, and I was much younger. And I think many of us had a full head of hair back then, but time passes. The questions that they presented to us were just fascinating. And let me just give you two. One, how does the government, the Soviet government, determine what's a fair and permissible return for Western investment? They didn't want to be ripped off, and they didn't really absorb the idea that there is no ceiling on what you can earn for investments in the West. They didn't like that. They wanted to figure out how to address it. They also had the challenge, if a joint venture is in a centralized economy and no markets, everything controlled, how do you, as a company, get your products, and what do you buy? There's no market, and what controls are imposed? These were among the problems. 3 months later, in January '85, the Soviets announced their new joint venture law. There were over 30 million consumers in the Soviet Union, and another 200 million or so in the countries they dominated in Eastern and Central Europe. These new markets were now opening up to Western firms.
Oh, dear.
And the potential for profits was enormous and enticing, but a lot of risk. As was John mentioned, we opened up a small office in 1989-90, later expanded to 16 employees. I devoted full time to developing a Russian practice, and I'd hoped the future of a long career that we could turn to that another time. As an American lawyer participating to some small extent in the market reforms underway, the following 10 years were filled with drama. It was challenging, exciting, eye-opening. For many of our classmates I know who had Soviet involvement, I think they would agree it was a very interesting period. And no one in the academic, legal, or political arena had ever addressed, and even the best economists had even thought about, how to transform a centrally planned economy the size of Russia's to a market economy. And no one in academia or anywhere in the world, in any academic institution, in any political office, the White House or elsewhere, ever imagined that the Soviet Union would dissolve. And so quickly, it just collapsed of its own weight before our very eyes. In the chat box in the Zoom, you'll find a link to an article I wrote last year when Gorbachev passed away. It was written as an obituary and a eulogy in the weeks after he died. And here you see my meeting with Gorbachev. The other person there was the interpreter in our office, who sadly passed away last year. I first met Gorbachev in person to person in late May 1996. I had a number of meetings with one of his assistants prior to that time, and he arranged it. And this was just a month before the June 1996 presidential election. My article explained the details of the circumstances. Gorbachev had decided to run for office, the first popular election to which he ever subjected himself. He anticipated a respectable showing, and the other candidates were flawed and had their problems, including Yeltsin, who I'll mention in a moment. But the results, a month after our meeting, were humiliating for him. He received less than 400,000 votes, a mere 0.5, 0.5% of the votes cast. And here was the General Secretary of the Communist Party. Yeltsin received 36%, and the Communist Party leader then was 32%. These dismal results for Gorbachev highlighted that the radical democratic changes, political changes that he envisioned, that he had worked during his career for, and also that the liberal reformers that were then running Russia, working with Yeltsin, that the whole project rested on very, very shaky grounds. I'd now like to turn our attention to NATO expansion, because in the years that followed this shaky ground, the whole society, the economy, and certainly the political has collapsed. And so here I want to focus on the Ukraine problem and see if we can dig a little deeper. And you see a map there, and what you'll see if you count the numbers, that NATO during this period expanded from 16 members to now 32. And in the late 1990s to the 2010 period, we find what some have claimed was the genesis or a genesis of today's crisis in Ukraine. And let me take you quickly through this chart. In the early post-Soviet years, the question of possible NATO expansion was put on the back burner. Although it was in the minds of many, Gorbachev envisioned that NATO would no longer be necessary, so the issue would be moot. There was now peace in the world, and why have a NATO? The Soviet Union was no longer a threat. When President Clinton came on the scene, he was sensitive to the angst of Gorbachev's successor, Yeltsin, regarding NATO expansion. Clinton wanted to cultivate close relations, and he knew NATO would pose a problem. So he and his staff developed a very imaginative program called Partnership for Peace, PFC, which was initiated in 1994. It was designed as a loose affiliation of NATO and former Warsaw members, and designed to put most of the problems of a security architecture on hold for a while. The PFC proved, however, to have no traction, and it was abandoned. During the second Clinton administration, the pressure by Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic to join NATO increased. Poland, in particular, had strong domestic support. And the complicated history of this was outlined in a wonderful 600-page work by Professor Siroti of Johns Hopkins University, who came out in 2021. It's entitled Not One inch. And I'll quote from her to make this shorter. When George Bush took office in January 2001, NATO expansion rapidly accelerated. In 2004, 7 new members were admitted. And Professor Cerroti then tells us, and she uses a car here as the imagery, and quoting, after Clinton and his advisors left office, they could only watch an alarm as Bush's son, George W. Bush, took the, here's the phrase, keys to the NATO car and gunned it down that open road. In 2008 in Bucharest, Bush also pushed hard for the inclusion of Georgia and Ukraine. And Professor Cerroti tells us, quote, for Putin, that Bucharest summit, coming on top of Bush's 2003 invasion of Iraq and his 2007 decision to erect ballistic missiles, was the proverbial last straw. She describes it as the breaking point. In 2012, to continue this brief chronology, Putin was reportedly livid at what he perceived as U.S. encouragement of domestic protests against the legitimacy of his re-election as the third term, for Russia. And then in 2014, and here's a critical turning point, and completely unanticipated, Putin was confronted with the sudden ouster of his protege pawn, President Yanukovych of Ukraine. Ukrainians had taken to the streets of Kiev to protest his refusal to sign a promised association with the EU. And here's a little aside that I put in 15 minutes ago, because it just came up today at the UN General Assembly when the foreign minister, Lavrov, made a point of highlighting that during those street demonstrations in Kiev those months, Victoria Nuland, who was the U.S. Assistant Secretary of State, actually joined the demonstrators. And Lavrov said 2 hours ago, this was solid proof that there's U.S. complicity in all the anti-Russian actions in Ukraine. And it goes back to then. And it was just interesting as I was getting ready to tune in, I saw this demonstration highlighted by Lavrov. And then to continue the chronology, to clear the streets and get rid of these demonstrators, Yanukovych, who was the president at the time, his police force and snipers then killed over 100 street protesters, young men and women, murdered them. And the next day, Yanukovych's entire security forces vanished, fearful that the retribution they might follow from the crowds and the enraged crowds would be overwhelming to them. And they simply didn't show up for office and disappeared for a while. Yanukovych, seeing this, fled for his very life within hours to the safety of Moscow. And Putin, who was observing all this surprising action, assumed that Ukraine might soon join NATO under a new Western-leaning government. And then he would then lose Crimea and Russia's strategic naval base there, its only access to the Mediterranean. Well, the seizure of Crimea that was then witnessed by the West and everyone was considered by some as an aberration, because all this happened from that had been nobody expected it, almost like the collapse of the Soviet Union. Crimea itself had been part of this Russian-Soviet republic before the breakup. In 1954, Khrushchev, whose wife was Ukrainian, made it as a gift to the Ukrainian people. And I note that his great-granddaughter has a PhD in literature from Princeton and wrote a book about Khrushchev and actually gave a lecture at Princeton in January of this year. And in her book, she says that the giveaway, the gift of Ukraine, of Crimea, was simply a personal gesture. At the time, frankly, no one considered that transfer of any strategic consequence, either Khrushchev or anyone else in the world. Now we turn to what's happened recently, and it started really in that same period when Putin also decided to invade through proxies Donbass and Luhansk regions of eastern Ukraine, and is now metastasized into the downward spiral that has led us to today's strategy. As to just in closing on the expansion that we were discussing, it certainly is a factor in all this, but events have shown that it does not really constitute the primary case and cause for the Russian invasion. Thomas Friedman, in just the last Sunday New York Times piece, emphasized that fact. And let me quote him here. Quote, Putin's war has never been primarily about countering NATO's expansion. It has always been much more about stopping a Slavic Ukraine from joining the European Union and becoming a successful counterexample to Russia's autocracy. And here, let me unpack in a few minutes, because our time is running, his conclusion here, and break it down into two very important factors to understand what Friedman is addressing. And the two subjects here is one, what I call the July 2021 manifesto. It's a 5,000-word essay published in July 2021. And Putin claimed ownership, although obviously for 5,000 words, he didn't write it all. It's entitled On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians. You'll find that link to that essay in the Zoom chat. All Russian soldiers were ordered to receive this manifesto. It was designed to explain the rationale for the plan underway for Russia to take over its neighbors by military force. The underlying themes had appeared earlier, but this was all put together. And a premise of Putin's argument is that Russians and Ukrainians, along with Belarusians, are one people sharing a common historical and religious heritage and destiny. Having said that, Putin contends that modern-day Ukraine stole historically Russian lands. The entire Ukrainian enterprise was, he says, quote, an anti-Russian project from its inception. And he goes on and says, it was fashioned by external forces since the 17th century. He's quite an amateur historian here. Then Putin compares the formation of an ethnically pure Ukrainian state, aggressive towards Russia, to, and we're quoting him, a lethal use of weapons of mass destruction against Russians. And the blame for this crisis is attributed to foreign plots, that's us, and anti-Russian conspiracies. And I note that Putin's claim that the neo-Nazis now control the Ukrainian government is both ironic and absurd, especially considering that President Zelensky is a native Russian and Jewish, both his parents are Russians, and his grandfather fought against the Nazis, rising to the rank of colonel. And also the Holocaust impacted his relatives as well. The Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights informs us correctly that Putin's July 2021 essay, that's my wife telling me I'm going too fast, so let me slow down. That the Wallenberg Center constitutes, quote, this is their statement, in his manifesto, laid the groundwork for incitement to genocide by denying the existence of the Ukrainian group. If you have the time, reading the manifesto by Putin is quite informative and it's chilling. You'll find that link as well. And now the final point about the motivations here. This can be found and most easily by looking at the following revelatory episode to make the point. And here, the background. The final decision to invade Ukraine on February 24th was taken by a very small group of Putin's inner circles. It was concealed from many whom you would have thought would have participated in that momentous decision, including Sergei Lavrov. We just mentioned it, the Russian foreign minister. He didn't know about it until the day before. And on the day of the invasion, an oligarch was summoned, part of the number of oligarchs summoned to the Kremlin to be informed of the special military operation. And one oligarch spied Lavrov exiting another meeting, and he pressed Lavrov for an explanation of why Putin had decided to invade. And Lavrov had no answer. And when Lavrov sensed the stunned reaction of the oligarch to his question, Lavrov added to the oligarch wryly and with resignation. I'm quoting the oligarch, I'm quoting Lavrov here, who said, he, Putin, has only 3 advisors, Ivan the Terrible, Catherine the Great, and Peter the Great. And here's a picture that you see of Peter the Great. A writer from the Atlantic Council explained the meaning of Lavrov's quip as follows, and here I'm quoting. From the beginning of the Russian invasion, the pernicious influence of Putin's historical baggage has been abundantly clear. Putin sees himself as a modern-day Peter the Great and his successors. The writer tells us Putin is committed to accomplish the sacred mission of reuniting historical Russia and to banish the idea of Ukrainian statehood. And I should add, Putin has readily admitted that Peter the Great is his hero. And here's a very brief BBC account of a speech that he gave earlier this year in St. Petersburg. He was talking to a group of techs, and he diverted to talk about his view of the world. And he said, and here I'm quoting Putin, "You might think," he told the group, "that Peter the Great was fighting with Sweden, seizing their lands." And he was referring here to the Northern Wars, which Peter launched at the turn of the 18th century when he was forging his new empire. And here Putin said this, quote, "But Peter the Great seized nothing, he reclaimed it, arguing that the Slavs had lived in the area for centuries." And he closed his remarks that day by saying, here Putin again, "It seems it has fallen to us too to reclaim and strengthen Russia." And they looked at the crowd, and it was clear that he was talking about what was happening now in Ukraine. And he added that it was proof that Peter the Great, by taking that land, was making Russia stronger. And some observers have noted, with a sobering tone, that the Northern Wars that Putin was referred to, this was in June of 2023, it lasted for 21 years. I want to close the presentation by asking 6 questions. First, many news reports indicate that the Russian economy is doing well, notwithstanding all the sanctions. That it's on a war footing, that defense companies are fully engaged, employment is high, shops are stocked, at least in Moscow, expensive restaurants are packed. And the oil that it can't sell to Europe is now going to Western Europe. And that couldn't sell in Western Europe is now going to China, India, and other willing buyers. It's clear that for the moment, the West's desire to bring Russia to its knees through economic sanctions is not working. My question to you, with its economy apparently adapting well to new conditions, where is Putin's incentive to seek a peaceful resolution of the war? Second question, Putin has the support of an estimated 80% of the population, according to polls that have credibility. He's running for re-election in March. My question to you, why should Putin even consider changing his policies at this time and imperil what is an assured re-election for another 6 years? Third, in March 2020, Putin enacted legislation to provide families of those killed in Ukraine with 5 million rubles, that's $50,000. Seriously wounded, the payout is 3 million rubles, $30,000. This is a fortune by standards of the cities and towns supplying the war's cannon fodder, which come from the poorest sectors. It's one reason, I believe, why we have not heard more from the many distraught mothers who have lost their sons in Ukraine, as we did in the 1980s in the case of the war in Afghanistan. Also note that new soldiers, new draftees, receive 10 times the average Russian salary, an incredibly high $2,500 per month. And my question to you is, how can Ukraine, with the population that is so much smaller, continue to fill its own depleted ranks when Russia can apparently replenish its supplies of soldiers in this way? And fourth, very short question, the war provides a basis for Putin to declare any dissent as treasonable in his country and to punish swiftly and cruelly any protesters. Political opposition of any kind results in retribution not seen since Stalinist days. Isn't this exactly the kind of state that an autocrat covets? And 5, very important, there's a consensus in Washington as in Moscow that Putin cannot lose the war and survive, both politically and perhaps personally. Michael Kimmage of Catholic University and his colleague wrote an ominous piece. Let me quote, "The Kremlin's ultimate goal is clear, strangling the Ukrainian economy, society, and state by whatever means necessary." Let me repeat it. The Kremlin's ultimate goal is clear, strangling the Ukrainian economy, society, and state by whatever means necessary. Moral scruples, appeals, and accusations will not deter Putin. The observation, by whatever means necessary, is cause for alarm. And here I want to lead to the nuclear option and discuss it briefly. Putin, in his State of the Union speech in February, included nuclear rhetoric, indicated that Russia would be justified in these circumstances in carrying out a nuclear first strike. But for the moment, we can relax a little because he does not need, according to reliable sources, to pursue the nuclear path. He's certain, by all reports, that he will ultimately prevail with the passage of time. He's convinced that Russia is more committed to the war than the West is to Ukraine. And in the coming weeks, we're going to see the basis for that belief in what happens in today's Congress, which is now considering a $24 billion proposal. If it fails, Putin will have further evidence of why patience is what why patience is making sense here from his point of view. The other point is that he's concluded, according to reliable reports, that the use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine wouldn't help at this point. And U.S. authorities are agreeing with that conclusion for the moment. These weapons have enormous power. The radiation diameter is still very wide. The fallout, air, soil, water contamination, like the Chernobyl nuclear reactor meltdown, is known to the Russians and Ukrainians. And for the moment, given how close the Russian troops are to the Ukrainian troops, we don't have to fear that happening immediately. However, we shouldn't have too much comfort because things are happening. And here's a not so hypothetical scenario. Right now, we hope that the Ukrainians can breach the entrenched Russians, which extends over 700 miles. It'll take a while, and that their mobile units can move quickly and overwhelm the Russian defenders. General Petraeus, for example, recently said that this counteroffensive is just in the beginning stages. The Ukrainians are applying considerable pressure, that Russia's frontline forces are exhausted, and there's no large operational reserve. The Ukrainians could well prevail in these grueling battles, although the timeline is likely to extend into 2024. And in this connection, I do want to refer you to Timothy Snyder. Again, it's the articles in the chat. He's a fervent supporter, and let me just quote him because our time is running out here. And he tells us, getting this war to end with the Ukrainian victory would be by far the best thing Americans could do for themselves. Indeed, Timothy Snyder tells us, I do not think that in the history of U.S. foreign relations, there's ever been a chance to secure so much for Americans with so little effort by Americans. But if Putin is actually confronted with imminent defeat or even humiliation, would his assessment change? And my fifth question I leave you with is, would he change his mind if he was, if this was his only option? And for support, disquieting is what General Kevin Ryan, who's an important retired general, just said in the past few weeks. Here I'm quoting General Ryan. If the Russian military is not able to prevent Ukraine from taking its territory, Putin will have no other way of escalating the war militarily than through a nuclear weapon. Final question, disquieting. Even if Putin somehow leaves the scene, will his successor seek a peaceful resolution? And let me quote from a recent piece by a very knowledgeable journalist. Quote, unfortunately, the people in Moscow, unfortunately, the people who have asked to talk to, insiders, they're saying, don't hold your breath about an anti-war coalition taking power. Whoever comes to power will feel obligated to continue the war because of the ingrained belief that if Russia loses the war, Russia will disintegrate. Given these many questions and so many uncertainties, can anyone be confident that we will not be confronted, all of us, with a Cuban Missile-like crisis in the near future, even possibly after Putin, and the potential for an unthinkable catastrophe for humanity? I closed with the more bright outlook that Peter, Jim, and I hope that when we have our 2026 reunion and we're all together, we can have another opportunity to have a panel discussion. And we pray that it will be very upbeat, that it will see an independent and free Ukraine, and that by that time, my faculty friends at Moscow's largest law school and the students there, whom I worry about every day, will no longer live in fear of what tomorrow may bring. These are dark times for many in Russia and darker for the embattled Ukrainian people. And with that, I close my prepared remarks And thank you for your time and attention and this opportunity, and look forward to the Q&A session, Terry.
Jeff,
Thank you.
thank you. That was terrifying, articulate, wonderful. You're going to have a lot of questions. People are going to ask you, I'm sure, to answer the questions that you raised. But
I didn't mean to do that.
That's all right. But I'll take them in the order that they came in. Carl Feldbaum is going to be our first questioner, followed by Henry von Cohorn. So I think we're going to try and bring Carl up on the screen here. Is that right? I hope so. There he is.
Yeah, there it is. Jeff, thank you. And my three-part question pertains to your sixth question.
Okay.
and the ending. So let's say the Ukraine counteroffensive or some future offensive creates a breakthrough, and in Crimea or the Donbass, and we have Putin on the ropes, and there's no clear off ramp yet that I can recognize or I've heard. So again, he threatens to go nuclear. So three parts, but connected. What have we done, or what do we do to deter him from his nuclear option? Second, what do we do if we detect a movement in his armed forces that indicates preparation for a nuclear or an event? Is finally, what's our response if he sets off, say, what they call tactical 2 kiloton, 5 kiloton nuclear weapon in a group of Ukrainian soldiers, or explodes one at 40,000 feet over the Baltic or Black Sea? How do we respond? How do our allies respond?
Well, when Putin gave his State of the Union message back in February, and he said the circumstances would justify a first strike, the France, Great Britain, and the United States sent off an immediate response within a few days, a joint response, and said to Putin, if you use nuclear weapons, we will respond with equivalent conventional weapons, and we have conventional weapons that have equivalent impact, in an effort to say, look, don't be surprised. It may not start a nuclear war, but we're going to get to you, and we're going to do enormous destruction. And I think that was a smart move, whether we take it or not. So in terms of what we do if he goes down that route, the best answer that our White House has come up with is, well, we're going to start with a conventional response and then see what happens. In terms of these very difficult questions, that's number 7 and 8. In terms of if we detect something about to happen, it's not a new problem that the Pentagon has been confronting. At what point do you take action? And I should add here, and I really think this is an important thing for us to think about. There have been many near misses, near accidents, near miss signals. Things have taken out of hand. Those of us who've studied, the Cuban Missile Crisis, there were many near misses. So the answer is, once the alert level is raised, who knows what may happen and who may take what move. And I have no idea, frankly, what to do when we anticipate tactical nuclear weapons about to be used. And that's why this is a time of great crisis, frankly, in the world, just because of your identical questions. What are we going to do? And how can we stop this? And if we're successful, if Timothy Snyder's hope is realized, that we win this counteroffensive, Ukraine prevails, what's going to happen to Putin? Will he resign? And the one thing that I just would add here, not to dwell on it, Khrushchev's granddaughter, I mentioned, went to Princeton, got a PhD in literature. She gave a wonderful speech in January, and she said the following. She said, my grandfather's actually a complicated family situation, but she knew him. He was alive for 10 years after she was born. He said, Khrushchev had a great heart. He was a good man, suggested that the Cuban Missile Crisis was solved in part because he had a big heart and was concerned about humanity. And then she said, Putin, she said, he's a mid-level KGB guy. He has no heart. He couldn't even get to be the general. He's not a terribly bright man, and he doesn't have a heart. And it was very condescending, but I think very true. So Putin is now in charge. And what he may do if his back against the wall, I just don't know. But I think his history here shows that he's brutal, that he's crooked, and that rather than go down in disgrace, this is our nightmare, he would take the whole world with him. And that's all I can say.
I had meant to let Peter and Jim,
of course,
and so this seems like a perfect moment because they bring the right perspective to this question that
right.
just asked. So if we could get Jim Hitch and Peter Pettibone on the screen here, there they are, guys. Could you each maybe comment on these broad questions?
I'll start off. I am very concerned about the continuation of the war, in part because of the huge number of casualties. We're approaching 500,000 wounded and dead, perhaps pretty much equal on both sides, and all the risks that we've talked about regarding a nuclear conflict that may come about, or the broadening of the other participants, Belarusian participants, it could expand. I am very much in favor of the Korea type solution, which is to negotiate and fight at the same time. You may recall that the Korean War has never ended in a truce. It was an armistice. It was the stopping of the conflict, but only after 2 years of negotiations. And where the war stopped was, in effect, the border between North and South Korea. And that avoids the question of a, quote, winner or loser. And it is decided militarily, and it is decided by the two combatants. So I hope that we can start negotiations, even though at this point it's premature. But at some point we can start, and we can move in a combination of negotiation and continuation of the fighting and end up with an armistice situation, no peace treaty, but it brings it to an end, at least the fighting to an end, and it stops this horrific killing and maiming of soldiers, and it also reduces the prospect of a nuclear confrontation.
Yeah.
Well, this is why Jeff and Peter and I have such interesting conversations from time to time, because we don't always agree. I know from my time, 9 years in Ukraine, through the Orange Revolution, but before this ouster of Yanukovych, that my attorneys and then the secretaries and their husbands were rabid about their own fear of an existential threat coming from Russia. They've been volunteering to fight in the trenches since 2014, when the first breach of the Ukrainian border in Donbass. They're not going to stop. And Zelensky is leading his people on this theme that this, guys, is now, there's no compromise here. We're not going to draw a Korean line. We're not going to have anything other than total withdrawal of Russia from Ukrainian territory. That includes Crimea. How could that possibly work? I mean, now this counteroffensive is not succeeding, but the Ukrainian soldiers, if they're continued to be supplied by the US and NATO, aren't going to quit. I'm confident. I feel that in my bones. And I think the only solution is going to be some sort of agreed peacekeeping force, because the Ukrainian border is open. They're not going to build a wall, so there's going to be something that polices that 700-mile stretch, as Jeff pointed out. And that's the real difficult solution. Who's going to come in? Who's going to support that kind of enforced armistice, as Peter has said, if there won't be any peace? But it's a very, very complicated issue. We've looked a lot at the Yugoslav situation of in Milosevic and Bosnia, and what the peacekeeping forces have done there, not really successfully. So it's not clear what kind of UN or other NATO or some other force could stop the Russians from coming back. That's the biggest fear. Even if they are repulsed and kicked out, even if there is an armistice, what's going to stop Putin from gathering his troops 2 years, 5 years, 10 years later and reinvading? And in the meantime, as Jeff pointed out, who's going to be a foreign investor? Who wants to invest in a Ukraine that can't control its own borders?
And can I add one overlay on that? Because I would hope that we can have peace there. And certainly if we have a NATO guarantee or we have them join NATO in some fashion, we could get peace. But Tom Friedman leaves us with a 10th question. Just want to quote from his Sunday piece. And let me just quote it. It says, "What if Putin decides he wants a forever war in Ukraine? He rejects your idea and will not play along with a quiet border with Ukraine for NATO to defend." And he says it, I have to join him. I don't know. That's why I say some wrenching geopolitical dilemmas, what does that mean, await us down the road. I mean, I would love it if we could get peace, but you point out that Zelensky and your colleagues in Ukraine will fight to the bitter end. They're not about to give up. He referred yesterday to the Prigozhin reliance on promises by Putin. Frankly, this is a terrible dilemma, and I just don't know how Putin's going to handle this. It would be certainly sensible for him if he's losing, if the counteroffensive is successful, if the Russians have to rush back to Russia. But I don't know if he's that kind of guy.
So we had half a dozen questions all on these topics. And so I think nobody, I don't want to have you repeat yourselves. So I'm not going to ask those, although if new things in this area come up, by all means, let's talk about them. But let's, Dave Lee, could you jump in? You had a different kind of question. Frankly, this is Dave Lee we want to bring up on the screen. There he is.
So I want to take a step back, Jeff, and George Kennan never favored the creation of NATO. He felt that the Russians were the most paranoid people. They were so paranoid they were beyond comprehension. So now NATO is there. It's a structure. And as you say, George Bush W jumped in the car, raced it down the road, got everybody else into the car, and now we've got a very large structure of NATO. I mean, has this increase in the number of nations in NATO confronting Russia, has it increased security for the world in Europe? Or is it ultimately increasing the likelihood of conflict between Russia and whoever its allies may be, North Korea, China? It's very troubling to me.
Well, that has troubled me, frankly. And indeed, Peter and Jim and I wrote some articles in the past years where we pointed out how the world looks from Russia's point of view, with NATO encircling. And if you had asked me 2 years ago, before February 24th and what had happened, whether NATO's expansion and the failure to somehow bring Russia into an acceptable security arrangement was the source of our problem here, I frankly would have agreed. But I think what the recent history has shown is that, thank God we have NATO expansion. Thank God we have this encircling. And one of the things about that map, we didn't have time. If you saw Finland, which just joined in 2023, and it's about a third of the barrier that now is between the West and the East and Russia, it's really incredible. I mean, who would have thought? And of course, Sweden now wants to join. What's happened, I think, in the world that we have, and here I'll use a phrase that I saw just last week used by General Zwack. He said it's a rogue leader. He said Putin is a rogue leader that he has taken the command of this huge country and its nuclear arsenal and is taking us down a terrible path. And because we have NATO, now an expanded NATO, I think there's some hope of trying to contain him. If we didn't have what had happened with this enlargement, we didn't have Finland and Sweden join us, we'd be in a terrible mess because we have a rogue leader, an autocrat that has enormous power. And I won't say he's crazy because I'm not a psychiatrist, but he's got this thing about Peter the Great. He's got this thing about Ukraine not being a real people. And I think given the reality of what we're confronting, I think NATO expansion has proven historically to be a godsend. And that's my view. And I don't know what Peter and Jim think about this, but if you have a different view, I'd love to hear from you.
I'd simply say, David, if you're living in Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, any other neighbor of Russia, you're praying to God every night, thank you for NATO.
Okay.
Amen. Amen.
This is a logical segue to a question from David Marshak, if we could bring him up.
My question, Jeff, is what is the likelihood, Jeff, of Ukraine joining NATO at some point?
Well, in some kind of NATO type arrangement, I think that has to be the result of what's happening here, unless Russia overtakes Ukraine and it becomes a new satellite. I think we're going to have security guarantees, NATO-like or NATO itself. There are some issues about NATO's requirements. They want a non-corrupt society. They want certain conditions met. And I think that has to be addressed down the road. And it may not be that simple because before recent events, NATO, Ukraine needed improvement. But I hope that's an outcome, a NATO type arrangement, because I don't think there's any other choice unless it's going to fall, and that would be disastrous for the world. Because if Russia prevails, if the Putin people prevail, what does it mean for the rest of Europe? I mean, how can they live with a conquered independent nation? I just can't imagine it.
And a follow-up to that is, if Ukraine does join NATO, doesn't that solve the problem of Russian advancement through any part of Ukraine's border in the future?
Yeah, unless they're crazy, absolutely, they would trigger a world war. That's my view.
So that leads logically to Chuck Kolchisky's question. Frank, it shows us A. Kolchisky on the list there.
Anthony, yeah. Yeah, well, that is a terrific presentation, very insightful, very good, Jeff. Thank you for that. If my math is correct, converting euros to dollars, the U.S. has sent in over $75 billion worth of aid to Ukraine. And Europe is roughly the same economy and population as the U.S., and they've given, I think, less than 30 billion. Why have they been so stingy with the purse strings?
Well, we're the rich uncle, and I guess we've been doing this for a long time. And I mean, they have a lot at stake, but that's part of Putin's calculation. He figures first the U.S. will fall aside, and he's seen the same numbers that you have. But Europe has been, Germany has been taking a lead, and Poland. Although, as you saw from today's news headlines, now Poland and Ukraine are having some sort of fight. I just think Biden and the U.S. has felt that our responsibility, because we're being the leader of NATO and we're the richest country and we see the need, we've been able to get our act together. And until recently, Europe was some of the Europeans were on the fence, and of course, the European community is now 27. That's a lot of people there, a lot of countries. and getting them all to read from the same page is a challenge.
And then some of the neutral countries, Austria, Switzerland, are they contributing very much? I mean, can we sustain this, both in Europe and the U.S.?
I mean, can we sustain this financing? Well, they say that the percentage of our defense budget that this 75 billion represents is either 3 or 4% ascending it. And so the argument is, well, we're a rich country and that this is money well spent. And I think it is. And that for the moment, Zelensky's going to where the money is. But yeah, Europe has as much at stake more than we do. And it's a real challenge.
Thank you.
Okay.
Frank Nestle, could you jump in? Frankie, sorry, I didn't give you a warning. Nestle, Nuessle, and then we're going to go to Carl Corey after that.
Yeah, thank you for that presentation. Yeah, it's very, very informative, and I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about America's political situation, about having elected Donald Trump in 2016, and now he's still a factor in our political lives, and how would you evaluate the political situation in the United States with regard to Ukraine and its impact?
First, we have, I don't know, how many, we have 70 attendees here.
We're up to 107 at one point.
107. So I want to be careful what I say because there's 107 people out there from varied backgrounds. But I feel confident saying that Putin is sitting back and is watching with glee what's happening. I think he was surprised, as we all were, in 2016. I'm sure, well, certainly I was shocked when Trump prevailed. And I think he's sitting back and looking to see what happens in the United States. And indeed, in terms of his ambition to expand an empire, he thinks he can be successful if our political system fails to preserve a democracy. And if our political system fails to fund a righteous war that the Ukrainians are engaged in. And that's the reality. And I used to say jokingly that if people like Trump ever take over America, I was going to Moscow because my friends there, I had a lecture, so maybe I'll become a professor there. And I would say, well, if this happens, I'm going to Moscow. All I can say is I can't say that anymore.
So maybe you better change that to Canada. So
if it would happen. No, I mean, it's really, I mean, for all of us, I mean, Princeton Nation's Service, we've done well in America. It's a society. And frankly, as you heard, I'm very proud I have grandchildren, more than usual. It's an enormous gift. And I had hoped that I would leave this world with the grandchildren in a better state than when they found it. You know, we were Cold War and Duck and Cover and Sputnik and all that. And 10 years ago, I really felt good about things, that I felt my grandchildren had a better world ahead. I don't know. I can't say that.
I'm in the middle of reading a book by a guy named Neil Howe, Howe, called The Fourth Turning is Here. And it's very interesting because he is sort of, as he did in his first book, which was titled The Fourth Turning, and that was 20 years ago when he wrote that book with a colleague who's since passed away. And yeah, it's not a pretty picture over the next 10 years, according to his evaluation. But it is challenging times, with the Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you for those comments.
Thank you, Frank. Carl Corey, you're up next.
Okay, I think I successfully unmuted myself.
You did.
And thanks so much for this talk, you and your colleagues. I've been thinking about this a lot over the last few years, and I'm getting less and less optimistic about a good, or at least a reasonable outcome. My question is a little more specific. It has to do with the issue of how they might eventually resolve this with a negotiated settlement, in which Crimea would be a major part. But Zelensky, as I'm sure you realize, has appointed a Crimean Tatar to be his defense secretary. There's no hint of Slavic language in his name. And do you think he was, in part, sending a message, political message internally in Ukraine, or to Putin, or to the rest of us by doing that? Or is it strictly on the question of he had to replace him with somebody who was good at it?
Well, you know, and I know Peter and Jim have experience. Tatarstan and the Tatars are an incredible group of people. It's a wonderful ethnic group. They've survived an enormous hardship, and I've known a few personally. One worked for me in Moscow. And they're the one thing Zelensky wanted to project is honesty. He wanted to give his own people and the West the sense that there was a guy in here who wasn't part of the system, who had run the state property agency there. And so I think selecting this guy who had a good reputation and was from a different ethnic group, who, by the way, have, I think, 12% of the population in Crimea, because that's where they were located at one point, much larger, was a good move by him to show that he was seeking honesty and somewhat of an outsider, because like many ethnic groups that sort, they're not part of the old boy network. So I don't know if that answers the question precisely, but I think it was a good choice, and the guy has a good reputation. You know, Zelensky knows that there's endemic corruption in the Ukraine. They were part of the Soviet Union, a whole corrupt society. Yanukovych was very corrupt, but the whole system was flawed, and he has a big problem ahead of him, because he's a wartime leader, they say. But hopefully, if we ever get into a peace situation, and if he can to keep the funds flowing, he has to show that he can reform Ukrainian society. And there I'd like to call upon Jim, who's lived and headed the Moscow office, the Ukraine office, Kiev for so long. What do you think about the appointment of this new defense minister?
Oh, I think he's sending a signal to all of us. He's sending a signal clearly to Putin, and he's sending a signal to EU, the West. We talk about NATO. Don't forget that Ukraine's always wanted to be part of the EU. In fact, when I got there, their Ministry of Economy was called the Ministry of Economy and EU Succession. That was back in 2002. So Crimea is not an important part, not an important oblast, region of Ukraine, other than now it's extremely symbolic, because there's been a violation of international law with Russia seizing it. It's critically important for Russia because the Black Sea Fleet is headquartered there. It has all this historical, reminiscence from Crimean War. So I think appointing Crimean Tatar, especially his homeland is now occupied by Russia. You think this guy is not going to be intent on defending the motherland, which is Crimea and Donbass and the rest of Ukraine? So I think it's a really good move symbolically. Hopefully the gentleman is capable, but I think also his getting rid of a lot of, I guess, all of his deputy defense ministers and defense minister. Jeff put his finger on the head on the nail. Ukraine's always been corrupt. It continues to be corrupt. There are passed laws that don't have any effect. And Zelensky won his presidential bid against Poroshenko, who was corrupt, even though they said they weren't going to be. So corruption, and they're not going to get any more dollars from the U.S. Congress if the Republicans, first, don't want to give them more money, and two, think the money is being drained off that's being given. So these are calculated moves. Zelensky is an intelligent guy. He's a former actor, and he knows how to deliver messages. This is clearly one.
I'd like to move on to the next question from Jim
Thank you.
Timby. Jim Timby, and I just want to say for those of you who don't know Jim Timby, who does not like me complimenting him, but I'm going to do it anyway. Jim is a 40-year State Department employee and arguably the most important arms proliferation, I can't even say the word, negotiator in the history of the United States. And so I was hoping he would have a question, and here he is.
Hi, thank you, and thank you for your presentation. We've all learned a lot. But my question is, how hard would it be for Ukraine to join the EU, and how long would that take? I mean, as you've said here, that Ukraine is not likely to join NATO anytime soon. That there are issues there. But what about the EU? You can imagine a potential solution where Ukraine joins the EU quickly, and NATO, there's a process for NATO down the road someday maybe. But what would need to be done to bring Ukraine in, and how long would that take?
First, I heard your Tiger Talk presentation, Jim, and I know you were personal advisor to, what, 5 presidents, six presidents? It's an incredible resume for those of you. And I feel unqualified to answer your question if you don't know the answer. And I don't know. I do know, though, and I think we all intuit it, that these are exceptional circumstances, that the whole peace of the world is at stake, certainly European peace. So I think if membership in the EU would be part of a package, and it would enhance the security of both Ukraine and European states, that they would do what they could to make it on a fast track. But I don't know the various hurdles required for European membership. It's the best I can do.
If I can make a comment, look at Romania and Bulgaria, who are part of the EU, and see how they have struggled to meet the standards. Ukraine is worse off than they are in terms of legislation that would be democratic, which would be, again, anti-corruption. Ukraine has very, very good black soil, black earth, and they're noted for agriculture, but they've had so many other industries, particularly chemicals, agricultural related chemicals in particular. They were doing helicopters. They were doing lots of high tech. They had the bomb. Remember, they had to be denuked when the Budapest Memorandum was enacted, which didn't work to defend them. So I think that there would be many, many hurdles for Ukraine. I think Ukraine itself has coalesced since the annexation, since the breach of the Donbass, because when I was there, East Ukrainians who spoke Russian didn't like West Ukrainians in Lviv who didn't even know Russian. They only spoke Ukrainian because they had not been part of the Russian Empire. They had been part of the Polish-Lithuanian Empire. So Ukraine in the last 13, 14 years itself has become more of a united nation, an integrating country, people that I think now they'd be much more likely to get into the EU than they would when I was there 20 years ago when they had aspirations to get into the EU.
We have time for one more question, and so David Rubenstein is going to get that question. David, I know you have a long question, so given that we have a hard stop, I'll ask you to state it in a short form. You're muted. You're muted, David. David, you're muted.
I think I just unmuted.
Now you are.
Now you're fine.
There's a quote from Keith Gesson in a recent New Yorker article. Gorbachev, about a summit between George Bush and Gorbachev in '89. Gorbachev thought he was discussing the creation of a new world in which the Soviet Union and the United States worked together, 2 old foes reconciled. Bush thought he was merely negotiating the terms for the Soviet surrender. I'd like to hear your comment. More pointedly, what do you say to those who say we have been forced to confront the Putin that we created because of a squandered opportunity? As for an end to this war, I see no alternative to negotiations, possibly one that may give Russia its naval base in the Crimea and result in some kind of shared governance in the Donbass.
Well, there are a lot of questions there. Maybe let me comment on two. In terms of Bush, I know he was praised for not trying to lord it over the end of the Cold War. He was very careful, didn't know exactly what was going to happen. I think Bush, frankly, handled it pretty well because he didn't go on public and say, we won the Cold War. Russia, the Soviet Union has been defeated. A phrase that I heard many times in the years I was there. Many Americans felt that. We won, we won. In fact, the Soviet Union just fell apart, I believe. So I don't know if I agree with two old men. I think Bush did the right thing. And in terms of this NATO expansion thing, as we discussed it earlier, I think in retrospect, in terms of we created Putin, an interesting question. I disagree with it. I don't think what we see now is something the U.S. or the West created. I think it happened because of Russian history, Putin's own background, his own. As I said, a year and a half ago, Jim and I and Peter didn't think he'd do it because we saw what would happen. This isn't unexpected. I think Putin surprised us, and I think he surprised everyone in not taking and I think he's just got this thing with there's no Ukrainian people, that he's Peter the Great. And he wanted to go down history. He's been in power 23 years. His popularity now is very strong, and he thought he could get away with it. And I guess my view is he thought he could get away with this, and he might have been able to get away with it had we not been surprised by the reaction of the Ukrainian people and the sacrifices they were willing to make. It's been something to observe, and Putin surprised us, and the Ukrainians surprised us. And that's the best I can do with your very perceptive questioning. I don't know. Since we're closing, does Peter and Jim have anything final to say to that? Because it's a good way to round out this discussion.
I'll just make one comment regarding Peter the Great. Peter the Great opened Russia to the West. Putin is closing Russia to the West.
I don't think that we can expect anything from the Russian people. I have a stepdaughter living there. They're all in terror. Everybody's afraid of going to jail for saying the wrong thing, but it's never been known to have any revolution by the people succeed. Only somebody at the top, whether it's the generals, whether it's the oligarchs, the political elites, this isn't going to happen until Putin is gone. Whether somebody assassinates him, Jeff, he retires, I don't know, but I think this is I'm very pessimistic that something's going to happen inside Russia, short of Ukraine defeating and ousting the Russians militarily. As Peter always says, this is going to be decided on the battlefield.
Jeff, we've come to our hard stop time. Thank you, I think. And I only say I think because obviously this is all scary stuff for us and our kids and our grandkids. But your presentation was absolutely wonderful. We don't always get to using up all of our time to the hard stop with questions, so you can see how interesting it was to everybody. And we had a quite large contingent of attendees. So thank you. And thank you to both Peter and Jim for joining us. 3 Princetonians is always better than one. And so I'll just close by saying that our next Tiger Talk will be October 25th, when we will be joined by our Nobel Prize winning classmate, Mike Spence. And within the next couple of days, you'll be getting an email about that and what Mike is going to talk about. Thank you to all for joining us. This is our 15th Tiger Talk. Thank you to Steve Harwood for being an extraordinary director of this program, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you. And thank you, guys.
Okay. Thank you very much
Thank you.
for another great program.